Welcome, and thank you for joining us here today to talk about our native bees in Maryland. My name is Sarah Yashua, and I've been a Baltimore County Master Gardener since 2014. It was through the Master Gardener program that I learned how essential insects are as part of a healthy ecosystem. And I also discovered that many of our most beneficial bugs are in drastic decline. With the pollination team, we reach out to the community and explain the importance of pollination for our gardens, for our landscapes, and also for our food supply. Without bees, most of our flowering plants would be in jeopardy. This includes your nuts and berries, your fruits, and many of your vegetables. Your dinner plate's going to be really boring without bees. So it's really important that we all learn how we can help promote healthy native bees so that they can keep doing that really important job of theirs for our children and for our grandchildren and for many generations yet to come. Those of you that may not be familiar with the Master Gardener program, it's a program under the University of Maryland Extension under the College of Agriculture and Natural Resources that takes that science-based knowledge about good sustainable gardening practices and makes it available to everyone in the community through various outreach programs. So if you're interested in learning more about Master Gardeners or any of the extension programs, then please visit our website. The things that we'll talk about today are who are native bees, where are they, why are they important? We'll touch briefly on the threats to their survival, and then we'll discuss those things that we can do to help promote healthy native bee populations. I think everybody knows about those European honeybees. They're always in the news. And they're hard-working, fascinating insects that are extremely important for our agriculture today. They were brought here as domesticated bees in colonial times. And they didn't cart bees clear across the ocean for pollination because there was plenty of bees here to do that. They were brought for their wax to make candles, since there was no electric, and for their honey as a food sweetener. And it's this domestication that makes them so incredibly important in our agriculture today. They'll live in a man-made structure. So you can put an entire colony of honeybees and put them in a box and put them on a truck and cart them clear across the country for a major crop at bloom time. For instance, there's 3 weeks in February when there's over 1 million acres of almond trees that all come into bloom at the same time in that California Central Valley. Agriculture like this would not be possible without the pollination services of our commercial beekeepers. Even though those European honeybees have been here for hundreds of years as an agricultural species, they did not co-evolve with our local ecosystems, and they're not native to North America. There are, however, over 450 species of native bee here in Maryland alone that have been essential for the reproduction of our flowering plants for over 100 million years. And most of our native bees are small, solitary, ground nesting bees that we don't even notice because they don't bother us. Everything that you've learned about those European honeybees, with our native bees, it's drastically different. There's no queen that lives for years and has tens of thousands of daughters tending and defending her nest. There's no waggle dance that can show all the bees where a good food source is, perhaps miles away. There's no honey, and there's no barbed stinger. Our native bees are really programmed for flight rather than fight. So you are very, very unlikely to get stung by a native bee. Now, 75% of our flowering plants today depend on animals to move their pollen, and that's almost exclusively insects. The pollinators visit the flowers for food. The nectars are rich in sugars, carbohydrates for energy, and the sole purpose for the plant to produce this nectar is to lure pollinators in to visit their blooms. It's kind of like the payment that the plant makes for having its pollen personally delivered. The pollen is also very nutritious. It's packed with protein, it's got essential amino acids, it's got fats, and it's got carbs. And in the case of bees, it's perfect baby food too. We probably already know that pollination occurs when that grain of male pollen is transferred to the sticky female stigma on a flower in the same species. Now, if it's the same flower or the same plant, it's called self-pollination, and many plants have developed strategies against this. If that grain of pollen is delivered to a different plant in the same species, That's called cross-pollination, and it's this mixing of genes through cross-pollination that results in more vigorous plants that are able to adapt with changing conditions. And what we'll find today is how important bees are for providing that cross-pollination service. All these flowers are competing to draw the pollinators in to visit their blooms, and the different traits that they use, such as their size, their shape, their color, their scent, and even their time of bloom, are called pollinator syndromes. And these traits have evolved to attract a specific group of pollinators. If a particular insect is most attractive to my traits, then they're much more likely to visit another flower just like my flower. Now, this coevolution between the insects and the flowers has resulted in this incredible diversity of species in both our insects and our flowers. Changes in the flower triggered adaptations in the insects, and changes in the insects resulted in adaptations in the flowers. And a good example of that selective adaptation would be those deep red tubular blooms that we all know attract hummingbirds, but few insects can actually reach the nectar reward deep inside. Bees easily see colors in the blue and yellow end of the spectrum. So flowers that are bright white, yellow, blue, or purple are most attractive to them. They can't really see red well, it'll appear almost black, but they'll still be very attracted to the yellow disc flowers in the zinnia, or the stark white anthers in the poppy seen here. Or they may be attracted to a strong floral or sweet scent. Many of our flowers have adopted nectar guides, which are visual cues to guide the pollinator into the nectar reward. They can be a contrasting color, such as those that you see in the irises here, or they could be ultraviolet, which is clearly visible to a bee's vision. This black-eyed Susan, under a UV light, reveals those ultraviolet nectar guides leading down to the nectaries. Once a flower is fertilized, it stops producing nectar, and it may change color to signal to the pollinators there's no more food. For instance, this aster, mid-November last year, has this one small little clump of flowers that are still producing, and they're still a vibrant yellow color. Notice that all the other blooms have lost their vibrant color. And of course, those Hyleas bees are all over that. Bees are the best pollinators for several reasons, and one of those is because bees are hairy. That hair aids in transferring the pollen between the blooms. And the bees generate a positive charge when they fly, which attracts that negatively charged pollen, and it can stick all over the hairs on their body. Many of our bee species are flower constant, and what this means is that they will tend to visit a particular species of flower on any single foraging trip. Bumblebees are really good at this. Even though they're a generalist forager, when they're on a single trip, they'll tend to gather the resources off of the same species. Most female bees have areas of these specially branched hairs called a scopa that are specifically for collecting and transporting pollen. And they're usually on the hind legs. They can be called pollen brushes when they're on their hind legs like this. There is one family of bees that has their scopa hairs on the underside of her abdomen. And this is a leafcutter bee. And here's another one that's fully loaded. Bumblebees and honeybees have pollen baskets called corbiculae. And these are indentations in those hind legs that are surrounded by those bristly branched hairs. Now they moisten their pollen with nectar first before they pack it into those pollen baskets, and it really holds fast. The main reason why bees are the best pollinators of all is because female bees collect pollen to take back to their nest to feed their young. All bee larvae eat pollen, and most of our female bees are built to gather it, and it's this foraging activity to gather pollen that makes them the best pollinators of all. Most of our native bees are generalist foragers. They'll collect pollen and nectar almost any flower that's got good resources, but up to a quarter of them are specialists. And what that means is that they may only collect the pollen and nectar off of maybe a specific family of plants. Maybe they'll only collect off of a specific genus of plants. And some of them are so specific that they will only collect resources off of a specific species of plant. I have two examples of species-specific pollinators here. We have this little sweat bee, and she will only gather pollen and nectar off of evening primrose. This is Lasioglossum oenothera. And my personal favorite on the right is a little mining bee that is the Andrenia irrigenia, and she only forages on spring beauty wildflowers. Now, specialists are really advantageous for the plant, but there's added risk to the strategy, because if you lose either the plant or the bee, you're very likely to lose both. Bees will live anywhere where there are flowers offering pollen and nectar. And our native bees range in size from this tiny perdita at about 1/8 of an inch up to a large carpenter bee, which is about 1 inch in length. And how far they'll travel for forage depends on the size of the bee. Like this large carpenter bee will forage for up to 1 mile for good pollen and nectar sources, whereas that tiny perdita's only going to travel a couple of 100 feet. Like maybe only across your backyard. The males don't sting, they don't have the equipment, and most female bees won't sting except as an absolute last resort. And no bees or wasps sting on flowers because they don't defend the flowers. And yes, it's just the girls that do all the work. Bees are complete insects that go through 4 stages in life. They're the egg, the larva, the pupa, and the adult. And the adult bees in the current generation don't typically come into contact with the next generation. The only parental care that that developing bee gets are the provisions in the brood cell. Now, the point at which the bee will overwinter depends on the species, but most of them are going to remain in their brood cell in their natal nest. Some of them will emerge, late season females will mate and then burrow under the ground. Most of them are going to remain in their natal nest. The female provisions a brood cell with a mixture of pollen and nectar that's called bee bread, onto which she deposits a single egg before sealing the cell and then moving on to supply the next one. Bumblebees are a little unique in that they may have multiple eggs in their wax honey pots. 1 to 5 days after that egg is laid, the eggshell is going to dissolve and the small grub-like larva is going to emerge. All the bee's growth occurs in this stage. As that larva expands, eating the bee bread, it's going to molt out of its exoskeleton 4 or 5 times. After that last molt, the larva is going to spin a cocoon around itself and prepare to go through metamorphosis into an adult. This is called their pupa stage. And those that don't spin a cocoon depend on the cell lining that the mother puts in the brood cells to protect it. The adult bees emerge from their nest fully formed and full grown. You're never going to see baby bees flying around. Like on the zinnia, may look like a mama and baby bumblebee. However, they're both full grown adult bumblebees. Might be 2 different species that have similar markings but different sizes. Or it could be a queen bumblebee and an adult daughter. However, you don't typically see the queens out foraging once she has daughters to do that work for her. Our bees will live and nest in all sorts of different social arrangements, but 90% of them are solitary bees where each female does all the work to construct and provision her brood cells. And she only has 1 brood in a year. There are solitary bees that nest in dense congregations where it looks like there's a lot of bees working together, but they're each doing their own solitary thing. 90% of our bees, that's almost all of them, are solitary. There are some communal nesters that share a common entrance but provision their own brood cells. Some of our carpenter bees do this, some of our mining bees. There are a couple of sweat bee species that are semi-social And this means that they're going to have 2, maybe 3 generations in a year. And those first broods are going to be mostly daughters. They're going to help tend the nest. And then we have our bumblebees, which form annual social colonies where they can have several generations in the nest by the end of the year. And they do have a queen, an egg-laying queen. There are 15% of our species are kleptoparasites. These are called cuckoo bees. And just like the cuckoo bird, they steal into the nest of a host species and lay their eggs in those brood cells. We have a cuckoo bee here and her host species. These are both in the leafcutter family. You can notice that scope of hairs on the underside of the abdomen on the host, but notice that the cuckoo bee has no scope of hairs. She doesn't do the work and she doesn't need the equipment. 70% of our native bees nest in the ground, and they'll nest in all kinds of different habitats, but typically prefer loose, well-drained, sparse, or bare soils. Some are going to choose earthen banks, some are going to choose flat areas. Our digger bees will actually bore down into hard-packed clay. But what is typically in common is it's usually in a spot that has sun exposure, and it's usually not in your richer soils. Most of the other 30% of our native bees nest in cavities or tunnels, that pre-existing tunnels that they find, such as maybe an abandoned beetle hole or maybe a hollow stalk or twig. And the carpenter bees actually bore holes for their nests. The tunnel nesters create their tunnel by creating partitions to make a row of brood cells in the tunnel. And the materials that she's going to use for her partitions depends on the species, but it could be mud, or it could be pieces of plant, or it could be secretions, such as maybe a wax secretion or a cellophane-like secretion. These partitions protect the provisions and the larva from drying out, and also protects them from excess moisture, fungi, and diseases. Now, the female can control the sex of the bee when she lays the egg. If she fertilizes the egg and it has the chromosomes from both parents, then it's going to hatch into a female bee. And if she doesn't fertilize it, it just has her chromosomes, then it's going to hatch into a male. And she's going to line her nest with a whole lot of females, and then the last ones she's going to make male. The males come out first in spring and they loiter around. As soon as the females come out, the mating happens almost right away. For the 6 to 8 weeks that the mason bees that you see in this video are active, she can lay 1 to 2 eggs each day and up to 35 eggs in her lifetime. And that brings us to our social bees, which are opportunistic. They find cavities to build their nest. For bumblebees, they'll look for a dry cavity that's either on or just under the ground, maybe an abandoned mouse den or a tussock of grass. And she'll excavate out more and create a nest of wax honeypot brood cells. And she'll also use some of those pots for storing pollen and nectar. I think we've all heard about honeybees swarming to a tree and building a nest there, but most of our honeybees live in man-made structures. Now, even if there is a feral honeybee nest out in the wild and somebody finds it, they'll probably knock it in a box and take it away. When we're talking about bees, we generally talk about them in their families because they are so diverse that it's really hard to talk about them in groups other than their families, because there's only like 5 families that we'll have in the mid-Atlantic area here, so it's easier to group them by that. And even though a family can have really diverse appearances and sizes, one of the things that's unique in a family is the structure and relative length of their tongue. Yeah, I can't make this stuff up. Well, the tongue's really important for a bee because it determines what kind of flowers that insect may have access to. And believe it or not, this little sweat bee has a short tongue. Like I say, we'll have the bees listed in the first 5 families listed here in the mid-Atlantic area, and we're going to use common names when they have one. Here are examples of each one of those families. We've got sweat bees, which are in the Halictidae family. We've got mining bees, which are in the Andrenidae family. The polyester bees are in the Caletidae family. And the bees in the Megachilidae family, we typically call leafcutter bees. And finally, we have this Apidae family, which doesn't really have a common name, but that's probably because so many of the genera within this family do have common names. This is where you're going to have your bumblebees, your carpenter bees, your honeybees, your digger bees, and your squash bees are all in that family. Now, we're going to look at 1 or 2 examples of each of these families just a little closer, just so you can see how diverse and fascinating they are. I think we're all familiar with bumblebees. There's like 14 species here in Maryland, and even though they're different sizes and colors, they all have a very rotund shape, and they make this buzzing sound when they fly. They will fly from early spring through late fall, even in cool, drizzly weather. They're generalist foragers that will pretty much forage for any good resources out there. They form those annual social colonies that have a queen in several generations. The daughters all help tend the nest. And the only bees that survive the winter are those late season females come out, they mate, and then they burrow in the ground. They're the only ones that survive the winter. The bumblebees are really important for agriculture because they can buzz pollinate crops that have closed anthers like tomatoes and blueberries. And they do this by disengaging their wings from their flight muscles and vibrating, and it knocks that pollen loose. Bumblebees are raised commercially and distributed to greenhouse for pollination. And that's mostly going to be your tomatoes and your strawberries. I think we're all very familiar with the large eastern carpenter bee as well. She's notorious for drilling holes in unpainted, untreated timber for her nest. And yeah, I know that everybody's going to say that she'll pick painted or stained woods, but she'll always choose that untreated and unpainted timber first if it's available. They're our largest native bee, look like a bumblebee, but she has that shiny, almost hairless abdomen. They're important for so many crops like the passion fruit, the blackberries, and the peppers. And here we've got one caught in the act of being a nectar thief, where it's chewing a hole in the side of the flower to get to the nectar reward without rubbing on any of the pollen. Now, males will do this frequently because they're not foraging, they're just looking for a quick energy fix. The Ceratina genus are small carpenter bees. They're about the size of a grain of rice. They're really small. And she lacks the jaw strength to actually chew wood. So she nests instead in those pithy stems, perennial stems. And the stem actually has to be broken open for her to get access inside. She is so cool because once she's done finished with her nest, she places herself as a guard at the entrance, and she dies there in winter, but remains blocking that nest, protecting it. Sweat bees, of course, got their name because some of the species are attracted to the salts in human sweat. These are all small to medium-sized ground nesting bees, and they can have the multiple generations. They tend to have a very complicated maze of a nest by the time that they get done. They have very short tongues, so they're going to mostly forage on flowers that have open, easy access to the pollen and nectar resources. There's been a real success with using alkali sweat bees out in like Utah, where they have these large alfalfa seed fields. But it's not a good environment for the honeybees or the mason bees. But all they have to do is create this salt flat border around the field, and these alkali bees really come into dense congregations and do a great job at pollinating those alfalfa seed fields. Now, even though we have sweat bees worldwide, the little green sweat bees, there's 4 genera of them. They're only found in the New World. And they're not really attracted to human sweat either, but they're usually this beautiful green, emerald green metallic color. But you can also find them in blue, teal, and even brass colored. Mining bees are tiny to medium-sized bees that nest in the ground, and they'll nest in all kinds of habitats. Usually they're going to prefer loose, well-drained, sparse soil, but they'll even nest in lawns. Don't worry, their stinger is so weak that it will not penetrate human skin. You can usually tell the mining bee because she wears her scopa hairs high up on her hind legs and even onto her thorax. The mining bees, most of the specialist bees that we have here in Maryland are in this mining bee family. And they have a very short tongue, so they can't get in those deep tubular blooms, but they're also able to buzz pollinate crops like our bumblebees. So they're important for blueberries and tomatoes. They're also important for asparagus and clover and a lot of specialists on sunflowers. They build their nest, usually it's a tunnel straight down, and then they'll have brood cells radiating around that central shaft. And she uses an oily secretion to line her burrow and her brood cells, which penetrates into the soil and helps stabilize it. Our smallest bees are in the Perdita genus. There's over 500 species of this Perditas, but we only have about a dozen that are here. And they're all specialist foragers. And I think they're typically like an 1/8 or 1/10 of an inch, but the smallest Perdita is in the US Southwest, and that's only 1/16 of an inch in length. And you only find Perditas in North and Central America. That brings us to our leafcutter bees. The bees in the Megachilidae family are unique in that they have their scopa hairs on the underside of her abdomen, and she collects pollen dry. And all the other bees use secretions, like wax secretions or cellophane-like secretions to line their nest, whereas the bees in this family all use foreign materials. And their common name will give you a clue as to what kind of building materials she's going to use. The mason bees will use mud. The carder bees will use wool-like plant fibers. The resin bees will use plant resins. And of course, the leaf cutter bees use pieces of leaf. And you can see this leaf cutter, frequently they've got their abdomen tilted up to keep that dry pollen from rubbing off. Most of our leaf cutters are generalist foragers, but some will specialize on aster and pea family plants. You can see this leaf cutter in the video really working to get that pollen rubbed off on her abdomen on that very complicated sweet pea flower. To build her nest, she takes her mandibles and cuts these specific size pieces to surround her brood cells. You may remember that in the other pictures, they were all doing partitions with dividing walls. She surrounds her brood cells, and she uses these oval pieces for the sides, and she uses these round pieces for the caps. And yes, she does seem to prefer our red buds and our roses for her building material. The European alfalfa leaf cutter is raised commercially and distributed for alfalfa seed fields. Also in that leafcutter family, we have the mason bees, and they use mud for their partitions. And one of the most famous of mason bees, of course, is the blue orchard bee, or bob. And this bee is in a class by itself when it comes to pollinating any early blooming fruit tree or berry bush. And what might surprise you is that her efficiency at pollination is due to her lack of efficiency at collecting pollen and getting it back to her nest. So they'll zigzag back and forth between the trees, and they crawl all over the flowers, rubbing that dry pollen on the scopa hairs on her abdomen. And they leave substantially more pollen behind on flowers than other bees do. The blue orchard bees are raised commercially and distributed for orchard pollination. And there is a western subspecies and an eastern subspecies. And there's trying to get some regulation in place to only distribute them to their native range to try and reduce the number of introduced pathogens in an area. Unfortunately, a lot of our mason bees are being displaced by the horn-faced mason bees. They were brought here from Japan in the 1960s for apple pollination, and they're very aggressive, and they're frequently outcompeting our native mason bees for the resources. That brings us to our final family, the Callididae family. They're called polyester bees, plaster bees, or cellophane bees. And they're named for this cellophane-like waterproof material that she uses to line her nest. Now, they like to build their nests horizontal, so you'll find them building them frequently on a vertical surface, like maybe an earthen bank, or maybe a fallen tree, the root ball. Or they will build in riverbanks because that waterproof lining, they can withstand some periodic flooding. The Callites have heart-shaped face, and as an identification characteristic, but the real tell on the Callididae family is that they have an extremely short tongue that is split in two lobes at the end. And she uses that tongue like a paintbrush to paint that polyester-like material that she secretes around her brood cell and her nest burrow. They really can't, because of that short tongue, they really can't get access to a lot of different flower types. So they tend to more forage on plants in the aster and the carrot family. Really cool. Every once in a while, sometimes they'll put a polyester membrane over her nest entrance, kind of like a little doggy door. And finally, the Helias genus is also in this family. They are called mast bees. You can see this picture from Sam Drogi's team that you can really understand why they'd be called mast, because they're little black bees that have striking yellow or white markings on them. They're unique in that she doesn't have any pollen collecting hairs. So she forages for pollen and nectar and stores it in a crop or a honey stomach to take back to her nest, which she'll regurgitate the contents from this crop and then float an egg on top before sealing it and moving on. So all very fascinating bees. It's really hard to tell the difference between bees and wasps because bees evolved from wasps. Shortly after the angiosperms evolved about 125 million years ago, that's for flowering plants, the bees diverged from wasps. They're kind of like the wasps that went vegetarian. So they can be really hard to tell the difference between them. But you're going to look at their shapes, and the bees are going to be a more robust shape, whereas the wasps are going to be more elongated and have that really, really narrow waist. The bees are going to have pollen collecting hairs somewhere on them. They tend to be hairy. And the wasps might have hairs on their face, but that's usually the only place you find hairs on the wasp. And the bees are all going to have stout legs, and they might have those hairy, the pollen collecting hairs on their legs. Whereas the wasps are all going to have these spindly, hairless legs. Now, they may have barbs on them for capturing their prey, but they're not going to have hairs on them. They're going to be these long, spindly, hairless type legs. Now, unlike your paper wasps and your yellow jackets and your hornets, all the bees that you see here all the wasps you see here are solitary wasps that are very, very unlikely to sting you. In fact, you really want to see like this blue-winged wasp in your yard, because she's going to burrow in your lawn and lay an egg on a Japanese beetle grub if you're unfortunate enough to have them munching on your grass roots. But all of these are beneficial wasps that do not sting, unless really a last resort. Now, for the bad news, like all wildlife, the bee populations are in drastic decline. And there's several well-known reasons for the decline in bees. The biggest risk of all for bees is habitat loss and fragmentation. With our expanding commercial, our expanding suburban lawns and agriculture, all of their native habitat is diminishing. Even in these rural areas where you'd think that they would thrive, the large fields with our large-scale agriculture are too big for most of the bees to cross to reach forage from their nest. Of course, pesticides are a real problem. It can kill the bees either directly, it can kill them over time from prolonged exposure. It can affect their development in their nest, or it could kill all the flowers that they need to survive. In the case of bees, the toxin is frequently transferred back to the developing bees in the nest on that collected pollen. The mass rearing of bees for commercial distribution has led to the introduction of countless alien viruses and other diseases and mites, such as and other parasites. And some of our non-native insects that have been introduced, either intentionally or by accident, frequently outcompete our native bees for those diminishing resources. An example of this is a European honeybee hive. It takes a good acre of all season long good flowering resources for that hive to thrive. And they're aggressive and will outcompete our native bees for what resources are available. As if all that isn't enough, climate change can break that synchronous relation between our specialist bees, whose timing is based on warmth, and their host plant that's responding to timing based on sunlight. So it's a challenging life indeed for our bees. The good news is it's really easy to help our bees, and we do that by creating habitat in the form of food, water, shelter, and a space to nest. And you cut down on your pesticide use. That's really all you need to do. So we're going to talk a little bit more about each of these so that maybe we have ideas on best ways to create that habitat for our native bees. As far as a site selection for a pollinator garden, don't call it a bee garden. It really does upset some people, but call it a pollinator garden because the resources are the same. You want to have it in a mostly open area, and it needs to have full sun at least part of the day. The goal here is to have forage and nesting opportunities in the same area so that they don't have to spend all their energy getting back and forth between the two. You want to provide good pollen and nectar sources in a variety of trees, shrubs, perennials, annuals, flowers, and herbs and mints. Sorry about that. And you really want to have a variety of sizes, shapes, and colors. For your perennials and your annuals, you want to plant them in clumps of maybe 3 to 7 plants, creating this patch that's very visible when they're flying by. You want to make sure that you have blooming resources from early spring through late fall. And if those good forage plants just happen to be a weed, then consider letting it finish blooming before you cut it back or take it out. Native plants really do have the best resources for native pollinators due to coevolution. And our native bees have a strong preference for the pollens on native plants. Of course, native plants have a lot of other advantages for us. They're less likely to require extra watering. They're less likely to require more fertilizer. They're less likely to need pesticides. They're not going to become invasive. Yes, we have some thugs out there that can be pretty aggressive, but technically they're not invasive. But our native plants are so important because they promote that native biodiversity that's really essential for a healthy ecosystem. Many of the native cultivars don't have the same resources as our native straight species. I have an abundance of these Heuchera americana, they're coral bells. I love them because they're low maintenance, they're long blooming, and they're shade loving, and the bees love them. The hummingbirds love them. It's great fun to watch the carpenter bees try to forage on those tender, slender stalks. But for interest, I added several of the colorful cultivars. And I can tell you who's not interested in them. I really don't get pollinators on those like I do on the straight species. So stick with straight species when you can. You could do a water source in the form of a shallow dish that you just keep moist with. You have plenty of pebbles or stones for perches. And if you're worried about mosquito larvae, just change out the water every 2 to 3 days. Now, if you could do a little muddy puddle in springtime, that would be an excellent building material for your mason bees. You want to leave undisturbed areas for shelter, maybe in the form of an untidy corner or two, or maybe piles of woody debris. it's very important to have undisturbed areas for those periods of time when the insects aren't active. So put off that fall cleanup until the new growth in spring, so that all those overwintering pollinators and other essential insects don't have their overwintering site disturbed. For your springtime blooming perennials, you can cut those stalks back to like 15 inches after they're done blooming. But anything that blooms later in the season, don't cut them back until the following spring when the new growth starts. And it doesn't take long at all before the new growth hides those stalks from people, but not from the bees. And it also hides all that wonderful leaf litter that you left in your garden because you care. For nesting sites, the most important nesting site to provide for our native bees are small areas of either sparse or bare soil that's close to flowering plants. And it can be loose, it can be silty, sandy, it can be rocky, it can even be hard packed clay. But the important thing is that it remain undisturbed until the following year after the adults have emerged. For those tunnel nesting bees, boy, there's just so many fun things you could do. You could drill dead trees, or you could make these little boxes with assortments of cardboard tubes or straws or hollow perennial stems or reeds. And they need to be 5 to 6, they need to be at least 5 inches, or you're going to end up with way too many males, as opposed to, you know, a nice mix of mostly females to males. If you're going to do one of these structures, this is a milk carton. If you're going to do one of these structures, you want to place it close to flowers, and you want to face it east so that the morning sun warms them up to flight temperature earlier in the day. But what you really need to do is replace those materials every year. If any of the bees have been, any of the tubes have been used, then you need to take them out. And what I do is in the wintertime, I take my nest down and I take all of the tubes that have, you know, occupants, and I put them in a cardboard box in a safe place that has holes in it so that they can get out. I have a greenhouse, so I'm really fortunate with that. Or you could do it with a shed if they have access out. Or you can leave them in the shed through maybe February, and then in mid-February, take the box outside somewhere where it's protected so it doesn't get wet. But you really do need to change the materials out, because you get too much of a concentration of, you know, fungus and mites if you don't do that. Oh, I forgot to mention about the bumblebees. For bumblebees, you want to let some tall areas of grass maybe grow tall and dense and then fall over. Just little patches, just let the grass grow tall and dense. And several of these native little blue stems would add great interest to your garden, as well as shelter and nesting opportunity. Turf grass has no food value, and it really limits the nesting option for our bees. So consider setting your mower blade to 4 inches and letting the dandelions and the violets and the clover all bloom before cutting. And if you really want to have that tidy mowed lawn, then consider an echo lawn that is a real low maintenance diversity of plant. It mix of grasses and sedges and perennials that would be provide a lot more resources for all of your pollinating insects. Long, narrow landscape features like fence rows and along roadsides can make excellent habitat corridors if they're planted with spreading native perennials. There's a lot of resources out there that can provide help for selecting what plants you want to do in your area. But remember, right plant, right place. If the growing conditions are right for a plant, it's going to do well without a whole lot of help. You want to go with the straight species, stay away from those fancy cultivars, especially the ones with the double blooms, because it's almost always at the expense of pollinator resources that they get those structures. And shop at trusted nurseries where you can get honest answers about the stock that the seeds and the plants that you purchase have not been treated with systemic insecticides. For some suggestions on plants in each season, it's really important in early spring to have early blooming resources, because you have bumblebee, the New Year queens are just coming out of the ground. They've used their fat reserves to survive the winter, and they really need to get that energy fast. There's also mason bees, and the mining bees are all coming out really early. So if you're lucky with me, I have shade, and I can do these ephemeral wildflowers, and it's just, they're a great resource for that. The bluebells, the spring beauties, the wood poppies, they're just all really good resources. For a little bit later in spring, those native columbines are great, and even just the common violets are great for our bees. Early flowering trees are really the best resource to have out there, because there's just so much resources available. And our native red maple is one of the best trees to have out there. There's also redbud, or maybe a wild crabapple, are all early bloomers. If you have a wet spot, willows are awesome for bees. They really love it. And then maybe a little later in the spring, if you could, the black cherry is another great tree for supporting a lot of biodiversity, a native plant for that. Now, those early blooming bulbs are not typically native, but they do have an early energy resource. So go ahead and plant your crocus and your winter aconite and your grape hyacinth. They love grape hyacinth. And for a little bit later on, plant alliums. The bees really love those. Now, when you're working on your vegetable garden, if you add clumps of flowers, it'll help draw the bees in, and it will increase your yield. For summertime, there's just an abundance of really lovely, long blooming, very attractive to bees, native perennials. I think Gaillardia was the one that was most popular. This is blanket flower, was most popular when I was participating in a study, but boy, that bee balm is the bee's knees. It's a real close second for attracting bees. And the mountain mint, I think this stuff blooms for like 3 months long, and it's always covered with my little green bees. And of course, Joe Pye, like the blazing star. Now, echinacea is not native to this area, but it is an easy to grow composite that the bees love. So we recommend you go ahead and do that one. For a summer blooming tree, the American basswood is really, really a good tree. And you could also do a pagoda dogwood for a native summer flowering tree. For autumn, it's still really important to have resources available, because you've got those last of the season female bumblebees that need to build up their reserves before they go dormant for the winter. You've also got sweat bees that are doing the same thing. And you remember the picture that I had of the Helias bees that were all over my asters in November. So please plant asters and goldenrods. And this native perennial sunflower is really amazing for the resources that it has late in the season. Of course, we've also got ironweed and sneezeweed too as well. Annuals can provide a good source of pollen and nectar throughout the entire growing season and well into late fall. The annuals that we've been most happy with the visits from the pollinators are the zinnias, the cosmos, the salvias, and of course, almost any sunflower, except for the ones that have been cultivated for cut flowers because they don't have pollen, so that they don't mess up your dining room table. So avoid those for your pollinator garden. And your herbs and mints. Now, if you're going to do your herbs and mints, you definitely want to leave them to bloom for your pollinators. And if you're going to do some of those mints, like that mountain mint, boy, that can be a real spreader, so you might want to put that in a container. The highly derived annuals from like the big box stores, your geraniums, your begonias, your impatiens, those have all been cultivated for human aesthetics, and they don't have any resources for your pollinators. So don't plan on them as being a resource in your pollinator garden. As for maintenance, you still need to weed, because you want your pollinator plants to get the resources, the sun, the water and the nutrients. If you intersperse your herbaceous plants like your perennials and your annuals with these warm season bunch grasses, you can get this tight living mass that really does resist weed colonization. Avoid mulching with those heavy wood and bark mulches, or maybe only mulch in your front yard. Or you can mulch with shredded leaf mulch or compost and actually improve your soil, as well as not putting a layer on there that makes it very hard for the bees to emerge through. You want to avoid tilling. Not only does it disrupt those microbes that are essential for healthy root growth, but it destroys the nest of those shallow ground nesting bees. And specialists like squash bees are going to want to put their nest right next to their host plant, so that when the new adults emerge next year, the plant's right there. And the tilling does not go well with that. And of course, leave the leaves. A way that you can help bees is to learn the integrated pest management in order to do less toxic treatments for pest problems you may be having. The extension websites are just awesome for this. They have an Ask an Expert, which is really good about identifying a problem you may be having. A lot of times it's not an insect pest at all. And at the Home and Garden Information Center, they have good information on how to do this integrated pest management. So you're always using the least toxic solutions that will work first. Other ways that you can help bees are to talk about them, maybe with your family, friends, and neighbors. You know, tell them the importance of bees. You could maybe work with a group to install a pollinator garden in a public space, or maybe with your neighbors, coordinate a habitat corridor between your properties. And if you know any people, family, friends, or neighbors that are having issues with a pest problem, then help guide them towards that integrated pest management solution, rather than if they go to, you know, like Valley View is going to tell them what chemical to put on it, and maybe it could be treated without that toxic chemical first. There's a lot of really good resources out there that we can help assist you with in order to learn more if you're interested. And that kind of wraps up our introduction to our native bees here in Maryland. I hope you found it informative and interesting. And remember, it's folks who care like us that are going to change the future so that we actually support our native bees. And it's so easy to do. You plant good pollen and nectar resources that bloom all season long. You leave undisturbed areas for them to shelter and nest, and you avoid your pesticide use. It's really just that easy. So thank you again for your attention. I really appreciate it. And be sure and spread the word. We need bees. Thank you.